the afternoon of August 15, 1945, the war that had consumed Japan for nearly 4 years had already ended. Emperor Hirohito had spoken to his people at noon that day in the first radio address any emperor had ever given directly to the public, and he told them the fighting was over. Yet at Kanoya airfield on the southern tip of Kyushu, a lieutenant named Tatsuo Nakatsuru stood on a runway lined with 11 dive bombers with every engine running and every cockpit filling with young men in flight gear. He had only been given orders to prepare 3 of those aircraft that afternoon. Nobody had told him why 8 more had rolled out onto the tarmac beside them. What happened in the hours after that broadcast was never confirmed by anyone on the American side, and the men who climbed into those cockpits that evening would simply vanish from the official record within hours. To understand why any of this happened requires going back to October of 1944, when Japan's Navy was broken apart at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The fleet that had once ruled the Pacific had been gutted across 3 days of fighting, and the officers running the war from Tokyo faced a brutal fact. Conventional bombs and torpedoes dropped from a distance were no longer sinking American ships fast enough to slow the advance. A vice admiral named Takejiro Onishi proposed something that had never been formally organized before. Rather than releasing bombs and flying home, pilots would fly their loaded aircraft directly into enemy decks, turning the plane itself into the weapon. Onishi argued that Japanese fighting men possessed a willingness to face death without hesitation, and that this alone remained as a tool to save the home islands from invasion. The plan was approved within 2 days, and the first unit of 24 pilots and planes took shape under the name Yamato, divided into 4 smaller squads. 5 days later, on October 25, 1944, the first kamikaze strike slammed into the American escort carrier St. Lo and sent it to the bottom of Leyte Gulf within minutes. The tactic that Japan's military leadership had hesitated to even name in public was now official policy, stretching from the Philippines all the way home to Kyushu. The word kamikaze itself meant divine wind and referred back to 2 typhoons centuries earlier that had scattered a Mongol invasion fleet before it ever reached Japan's shores. Wartime propaganda pushed the idea that dying for the emperor represented the highest honor available to a young man, and cherry blossom emblems were painted onto the sides of aircraft and stitched onto headbands as a symbol of a life that bloomed briefly and beautifully before falling to the ground. Pilots chosen for these missions were mostly between 18 and 24 years old, pulled straight out of universities and flight schools, with barely any combat experience behind them. Training that should have stretched across many months was compressed down to roughly 30 days, and even that short window was often disrupted further by American air raids, destroying fuel stores and aircraft while they still sat on the ground. Instructors drilled the young men never to close their eyes during the final seconds of a dive, since doing so would only cause the strike to miss its mark. Behind the official language of sacrifice and honor, many of these same pilots wrote privately in diaries about fear and loneliness and quiet confusion about why their remaining days had effectively been decided for them without ever asking their full consent. Social pressure inside every unit made refusal something close to unthinkable. A man who hesitated in front of his squadron risked shaming his entire family. The officer overseeing much of this campaign during its final and most desperate months was Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki. Born in 1890 to a farming family in Okayama, Ugaki had graduated near the top of his class at the Naval Academy and spent more than 3 decades climbing through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He served as Chief of Staff under the legendary Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and was riding in a separate bomber trailing Yamamoto's own aircraft in April 1943 when American fighters ambushed both planes over Bougainville in an operation the Americans had planned in advance after breaking Japanese naval codes. Yamamoto's aircraft went down in flames over the jungle and he was killed instantly. Ugaki's plane hit the ocean at high speed and broke apart, yet he was one of only 3 men aboard who survived the crash. After months of recovery from his injuries, he took command of Japan's most powerful battleships and led them through the disastrous Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the giant battleship Musashi absorbed wave after wave of American bombs and sank beneath the waterline while he watched from a sister ship nearby. In February of 1945, Ugaki was given command of the 5th Air Fleet based in Kyushu, and he ran the operation from a headquarters carved into a hillside cave to shield himself and his staff from the American B-29 bombers striking the Japanese mainland almost every day. From that cave, he launched a long-range strike against the American fleet gathered far to the south at Ulithi Atoll in March, sending modified bombers on a one-way mission with barely enough fuel to reach the target. Once the Battle of Okinawa began in April, he ordered the opening waves of Operation Kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemum, which sent hundreds of kamikaze aircraft crashing against American ships anchored around Okinawa over the following weeks. In May, one kamikaze strike tore into the battleship New Mexico, setting off flames rising 200 feet into the night sky and killing 58 sailors outright, with dozens more badly burned. Despite the staggering scale of the campaign, not one American warship larger than a destroyer was ever sunk directly by these attacks that spring. Ugaki kept building his reserves anyway, hiding hundreds of aircraft and small suicide motorboats across Kyushu in preparation for the American invasion of the home islands he still believed was coming. That invasion never arrived. Instead, at noon on August 15th, the Emperor's recorded voice crackled out over Japanese radio for the first time in the nation's history and told the country to accept terms amounting to unconditional surrender. Ugaki listened to the broadcast inside his cave headquarters and then sat down and wrote in the diary he had kept faithfully through nearly the entire war. He noted that he personally had not yet received any formal order to cease fire through his own chain of command. He wrote that the failure to stop the American advance rested on his shoulders alone, and that he intended to fly one final mission that same evening to demonstrate the true spirit of Bushido, the ancient samurai code of honor that had guided Japanese warriors for centuries. He described feeling more ashamed of himself than at any other point in his life, and said he had no room left to reconsider since no ceasefire order had reached him through any official channel. He expressed hope that the Japanese people would somehow endure the hardships still ahead and eventually rebuild the nation, and one day reverse the defeat that had just been announced to the world. His own staff officers argued hard against the idea. A senior commander flying a personal suicide mission hours after his country had already surrendered served no military purpose whatsoever and would only embarrass Japan further. Ugaki would not be moved by any of it. He shared a final toast with his staff that afternoon, and at 4 o'clock walked out onto the flight line at Kanoya, fully expecting to find only the 3 aircraft he had personally ordered prepared. Instead, he found 11 armed dive bombers sitting fueled and ready, with 22 pilots and crewmen standing beside them wearing white headbands marked with the rising sun in the fading afternoon light. Lieutenant Tatsuo Nakatsuru had been the one given the original order to prepare only 3 planes for the mission. When Ugaki arrived and asked why so many more sat waiting on the tarmac, Nakatsuru answered him with his voice breaking under the weight of the moment. He explained that none of the men serving under him could bear to stand on the ground and watch their commander fly alone toward his own death. If Ugaki intended to crash his aircraft into an enemy ship, every pilot stationed at that base wanted the same chance to go down beside him. Ugaki accepted what his men were offering him. He climbed into the rear seat of a Yokosuka dive bomber known to American pilots by the reporting name Judy, belonging to the 701st Naval Air Group and piloted personally by Nakatsuru. That rear compartment had only ever been built to carry 2 men total, but a warrant officer named Akiyoshi Endo, whose seat on the mission roster Ugaki had effectively taken for himself, climbed in as well, rather than be left standing on the ground. That left 3 men folded into a space designed for 2, while every other aircraft on the runway carried its standard pair of crew. Before boarding, Ugaki posed briefly for photographs on the tarmac. He quietly removed the insignia marking his rank from his dark green uniform and carried nothing personal with him except a short ceremonial sword that Admiral Yamamoto himself had once given him as a gift years earlier. His final radio transmission before departure acknowledged that 6 months of fighting under his direct command had failed to stop what he called the arrogant enemy from reaching Japan's shores, and placed the blame for that failure squarely on himself. He said he still believed the empire would endure forever, and that the spirit behind the special attack units would never truly die inside the Japanese people. He announced he was heading toward Okinawa, where so many young Japanese men had already fallen, and that he intended to crash his own aircraft into an American ship that very night. The 11 aircraft lifted off from Kanoya into the darkening evening sky and turned southwest, tracing a path down through the chain of Ryukyu Islands toward the smaller island sitting north of Okinawa, where American ships and aircraft remained fully alert, even hours after the surrender announcement had already gone out worldwide. 3 of the 11 planes developed engine trouble somewhere along the route and turned back toward Kyushu, leaving 8 aircraft continuing on through the darkness toward the target area. Aboard Nakatsuru's plane, Endo operated the radio set wedged behind him and relayed a running series of position reports back to Kanoya as the last light disappeared from the water below. The final message anyone at Kanoya ever received from that aircraft arrived at 7:24 in the evening and reported simply that the plane had begun its dive toward an American vessel somewhere below them in the dark. No confirmation of that dive ever arrived from the American side of the ocean. Naval records kept by the United States that night contain no account of any successful kamikaze strike anywhere near Okinawa on that date. The most likely explanation based on later research is that American anti-aircraft fire caught the incoming plane somewhere over open water before any of them reached a ship, or that the aircraft simply ran out of fuel and options in total darkness and went down into the sea. No precise record exists from any Navy or Marine fighter squadron of intercepting aircraft in that stretch of ocean at that exact hour, despite the near certainty that something violent brought those planes down before they ever reached their targets. The following morning, the crew of an American landing ship designated LST-926 was moving along the coastline near the small island of Ihejima, north of Okinawa, when someone spotted smoke still curling up from wreckage scattered across the beach. Walking closer, the sailors found the scorched remains of what had clearly been an aircraft cockpit, and inside the twisted metal lay the bodies of 3 men. One body wore a dark green uniform stripped of any visible rank insignia. His head had been crushed on impact, and his right arm was missing entirely from the wreckage. Lying in the sand nearby was a short ceremonial sword. The sailors who found the scene had no way of knowing at that moment exactly who the man in the dark green uniform had once been. They dug shallow graves in the sand and buried all 3 men where they had fallen without ceremony. It was only afterward, through careful investigation and matching against the mission roster, that the body was formally identified as Vice Admiral Motome Ugaki himself, killed alongside Lieutenant Tatsuo Nakatsuru, who had piloted the aircraft to the very end, and Warrant Officer Akiyoshi Endo, who had refused any chance of staying safely behind on the ground. Ugaki was posthumously awarded Japan's Order of the Rising Sun with a neck ribbon for his final act, though the mission itself accomplished nothing beyond adding 3 more names and 8 additional aircraft crews to a war that had technically already ended hours earlier. His flight is now generally recognized among historians as the last confirmed kamikaze mission ever flown carried out, after his own government had already told its people the fighting was finished. Nakatsuru had gone from a lieutenant handed orders to ready 3 aircraft to the pilot flying his own commanding officer on a mission that directly violated the surrender his country had just formally accepted, and no one above him had ever ordered it to happen. He and every other pilot who lifted off from Kanoya that evening did it because refusing had become something close to impossible after years of training, built to leave almost no room for any other ending. Across the entire kamikaze campaign stretching from October 1944 through those final flights in August 1945, roughly 4,000 men died carrying out these missions. Around 3,000 of them were young pilots barely out of their teenage years, and roughly 1,000 were university students pulled directly from their studies and pushed into cockpits within weeks. More than 400 died attacking targets near the Philippines alone, and over 950 died during the Okinawa campaign specifically. Many left behind diaries and letters describing love for their families and quiet private doubts about the cause they had been told they must die for. None of that private doubt changed what happened on the runway at Kanoya during the final evening of the war, when 11 aircraft took off anyway, carrying men who had every reason left in the world to stay on the ground and chose the darkening sky instead.